Ever get that feeling? Like you're cruising along, feeling good about your English, then wham, someone throws a brush up on or a get along with your way. And suddenly you're like, wait, what?
It's those little curveballs English throws at us. These word combos that don't quite add up if you think too hard about each separate word.
Right, right. And that, my friend, is precisely what we're diving deep into today, phrasal verbs. We've got a whole stack of linguistic goodies here. Definitions, classifications, even a bit of history on these tricky devils. Ready to decode the mystery with me?
Oh, absolutely. Let's unravel why they can be such a brain twister. They're what we call, in the biz, non-compositional, meaning you can't just take the verb and the other bits, like a preposition, and smush their meanings together to get the full picture. It's just not that simple.
Okay, so walk me through an example here.
Okay, look up. Individually, look up, no problem, right? But combine them. You look up to someone, you look up information, you tell someone to look up if they're feeling down. It's like each combo has its own little rule book.
So it's not just the words themselves, but how they hit the stage together, their own little
Oh.
performance. No wonder it throws people off. But before we dive into that, let's break it down structure-wise. It's not always just a verb and one other word, right?
You're right, it gets even wilder. Sometimes it's verb plus a particle, like run into, give up. Sometimes it's a verb and a preposition pair. Think talk to, depend on. And just to keep things interesting, you get the triple whammy. Verb, particle, and a preposition.
All right, hit me with an example of that last one, that triple threat.
Put up with, like I can't put up with this traffic anymore. Short, but man, it's packed with meaning. That's part of why they're so expressive, though. They get right to the point.
To do. But how do we tell the difference, right? Is it a preposition just hanging out near a verb? Or a full-on card-carrying phrasal verb?
So there's this neat little trick. We call it the shifting test. Imagine she turned down the job offer. Now, can you move down after offer? Like she turned the job offer down.
Yeah, I can totally hear that. Sounds all right to me.
There you go. That means down is acting like a particle. Phrasal verb territory. Try that with a prepositional verb, it just clunks. You wouldn't say she walked the street down instead of she walked down the street. It just sounds wrong.
Shifting test. I'm going to remember that. It's like a little word puzzle in your sentence. I like it.
And like those puzzles, the more you practice, the more those patterns start to click.
So we've got these building blocks, but where did this all come from? It seems like phrasal verbs, they're this uniquely English quirk. Did they just pop up one day to mess with language learners?
Oh, they've got a history. Deep roots, we're talking all the way back to Old English. They were crazy about prefixes back then, in, up, at the start of words. But those prefixes, they got restless. Over time, they scooted over to the end of verbs, transformed into the particles we see in our phrasal verbs today.
So look up used to be something like uplook or... That's wild.
It's like word genealogy. You uncover these connections to the past. It's fascinating. And here's a surprise. English isn't the only one who does this whole separable verb thing. You'll find them in other Germanic languages. Dutch, German, they're in on it too.
So it's not just some random English quirk. It's a family affair. Knowing that makes me feel like understanding them is less about memorizing a zillion random phrases and more about tapping into this deeper linguistic connection, right?
Exactly. It's seeing the patterns, the logic, the rhyme and reason. And speaking of patterns, those phrasal verb compounds you mentioned, those are like the cool cousins, taking those combined meanings, forging them into brand new words.
Right, like outset, input, standby, they've all got that phrasal verb DNA. They've leveled up in the word building game.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is even within these compounds, you can see language evolving. Like the word order gives you clues about its age. Particle before the verb, like outset, that's older, something you might find in other Germanic languages. But particle after the verb, backup, that's newer, a more modern development.
So even in these compounds, you see that blend of old and new, language always changing, adapting. That's so cool. It really shows that language is alive.
Absolutely. It's a living, breathing thing. It's got its own history, its rules, its little quirks. That's what makes it so fascinating.
You got that right. Okay, so we've got a good sense of what phrasal verbs are, how they're built, where they come from. But let's dig into those sources you've got. There's always more to uncover, right? So I'm looking at this mountain of sources on phrasal verbs you've got here. Linguistic texts, articles. It's a gold mine. What's really jumped out at you as we've been sifting through it all?
Honestly, it's the sheer volume, the variety. It's not just a handful of these phrasal verbs. We're talking hundreds, right? Each one with its own little twist of meaning. It's a lot.
It really is. It's like English took one verb and said, hold on, how many ways can we remix this thing?
Hmm.
But how do you wrap your head around all of them? Is it just brute force memorization?
That's where it gets interesting. Memorizing might get you so far, but it's not a long-term strategy. The real key is those underlying patterns. How those particles, those prepositions, they nudge the verb's meaning in all these different directions.
So it's about getting a feel for the dance, not just memorizing every single step.
Exactly. Like learning to dance, right? You don't memorize every combination, you learn the basic moves, the flow. Then you can improvise, find your own rhythm.
I like that. Phrasal verb fluency. It's like finding your groove. So where do we even start? How do we develop that?
The sources all agree exposure is key. The more you bump into phrasal verbs in the wild, reading, listening, watching a flick, it just seeps in. You start to feel those nuances without overthinking it.
Practice makes, well, maybe not perfect, but definitely more fluent. But what about those times when we hit a phrasal verb wall? You see one and you're like, nope, no clue. What then?
Those moments, those are gold. Seriously, jot it down, grab a good dictionary, one that gives you examples, and use it yourself.
Turning huh into aha moments.
Yes, and don't forget context. The other words around your mystery phrasal verb, often they're giving you clues, like a word puzzle.
It's like being a language detective, right?
Uh,
Piecing together the clues to crack the code. Speaking of codes, one thing that comes up in these sources is this whole phrasal verb versus prepositional verb debate. Why is everyone so hung up on that?
that's a good one. Linguists love a good debate, right? Some say that distinction is crucial, that you got to understand it to really get English grammar. Others, and I'm in this camp, we think it can be a bit of a head scratcher, especially for learners.
So you're saying getting lost in the weeds of defining every single type might not be the best strategy.
Right. It's interesting from a linguistic point of view, sure, but practically. Focus on the bigger picture. Recognize these multi-word verbs, get that they don't always mean what you think they mean, and find your strategies to decode them.
It's like you don't need to know the Latin name of every flower to enjoy a garden, right?
Exactly. Focus on the fluency, the confidence. Now, that shifting thing we talked about, that can trip people up, where the particle moves around. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, that's the part that always gets me. What's the deal with that?
So, rule of thumb, you can often shift that particle when the object is a pronoun. Pick it up, or pick up the book. Both work. But you wouldn't say pick the book up, right? Sounds weird.
So those little pronouns have more freedom to roam.
Exactly. It's not just grammar rules. There's rhythm to it, a natural flow. Native speakers just do it. You pick it up as you go.
It's those subtle things, right? They make all the difference.
Yeah.
So, speaking of specifics, let's talk examples. What are some of the phrasal verbs from the sources that we can really sink our teeth into? So any phrasal verbs from these sources, any that stand out as like the all-stars, the ones we got to unpack.
Run into always seems to trip people up, and it's a perfect example of how the same combo can be a phrasal verb 1 minute, a prepositional verb the next. It's all about context.
Ooh, okay, I'm listening. Example time.
So, I ran into an old friend at the coffee shop. It's part of a prepositional phrase. Into an old friend, it's about where you were running, the direction. But then I ran into some trouble with my project. Boom. Now into trouble. It's a unit. It means encountering a problem. Phrasal verb territory.
So it's all about the object of the verb, right? Run into a friend versus run into trouble. Two different vibes.
Exactly. And that's why that intuition, that feel for phrasal verbs, it's so important. You start to sense those cues without even realizing it.
It's like our brains are becoming phrasal verb whisperers or something. We're picking up on those secret messages.
I like it. We're decoding the language.
Yeah.
And speaking of decoding, those phrasal verb compounds we talked about, they really show how language, it's not static, it's always evolving.
Right, takeover becomes takeover. Set up turns into set up. They spawn new words. It's like they've got this hidden talent.
It's true. It's built-in creativity right there in the language itself. And the cool thing is, it's still happening. Who knows what new words are brewing from the phrasal verbs we're using right now?
The future of English, built on phrasal verbs. I like it. It really highlights how language is alive, always changing and adapting. That's what makes it so fascinating, so much to explore.
Absolutely. It's a journey, that's for sure. Never a dull moment.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Structure, history, those tricky distinctions, even how phrasal verbs, they're like word-building machines. But before we wrap up, any final words of wisdom for our listeners out there ready to conquer these phrasal verb challenges?
I'd say approach them with a sense of fun. Don't be afraid to play around, make mistakes. Embrace the quirks. That's what makes English English.
I love that. Don't try to memorize the whole dictionary. Focus on the patterns, the context, and don't be shy. Use those dictionaries.
Exactly. Learning a language should be an adventure.
Absolutely. So, to everyone listening, the next time you bump into a phrasal verb that makes you scratch your head, remember what we talked about today.
Yeah.
You've got this. You've got the tools to figure it out, to use it like a pro. And until next time, on The Deep Dive, keep those linguistic wheels turning.